Hi everyone, it's Andrea from Blackthorn Support, and today we are going to review our December 2020 payments release. So first we'll just kind of cover our agenda. First we'll go through the upgrade instructions and considerations. Then we'll look at our new features, which include SCA support for PayLink and donations checkouts. We also have MOTO support for manually keyed transactions. We'll talk a little bit about strong customer authentication and the regulations that are being imposed for customers in the European Economic Area. Then we'll go through enhancements and new fields, followed by bug fixes, and then I will talk a bit about an upcoming release update in the summer 21 Salesforce release that if you're currently using in test run can affect our virtual terminal. So upgrade instructions and considerations. First, make sure you review our December 2020 release notes. They are full of detail on everything that we've included in this release, as well as links to other feature pages in our documentation with more information. You'll want to upgrade to payments version 5.13. That's our December version. Please upgrade your sandbox first and do some of your own regression testing. We always recommend that you make sure that everything, all of your customization and custom processes are working in a sandbox on the latest version before you upgrade your production environment. Also very important, PayLink is a separate package, so you want to please make sure that you are also on the latest version of PayLink. We have found that there are some dependencies between the PayLink versions and the payments versions, so it's very important that you keep these up to date to prevent potential compatibility issues causing interruptions in your PayLink functionality. The first new feature we'll talk about today is SCA with Stripe for PayLink and donations. So what is SCA? Strong customer authentication is a new European regulatory requirement to reduce fraud and make online payments more secure. To accept payments and meet SCA requirements for those customers affected, we have built additional 3D secure authentication into our checkout flow for PayLink and donations when you're using Stripe. SCA requires authentication to use at least 2 of the following 3 elements, which I've listed in the bullets on this slide. And who is affected by SCA? Well, this regulation applies to online payments where the customer's bank and the business taking the payment are both in the European Economic Area. So I want to quickly show you how to configure your Salesforce org to accept SCA payments if you are affected by this regulation, and then I'll run through a quick example of what the customer experience would look like for your end user, or what the changes will look like in donations or donations app and PayLink. So let me switch over to Salesforce. The first thing that you're going to want to do is enable SCA in your Salesforce org, and the way that this is done is through a custom setting. So I'm going to go to Setup, and when this page loads, I'm going to type custom setting into the quick find. All right, and then we have we have a few custom settings, but the one you're looking for is Blackthorn Pay trigger settings. I'm going to click Manage beside this custom setting. And there are quite a few controls in this custom setting, but the one you're looking for is called Enable SCA. And you just want to make sure that this is checked. So I already have this checked in this particular Salesforce org, but if you needed to check it, you just click Edit here on this page, and then you'll see that now you're able to edit these settings. And just make sure that Enable SCA is checked. You save that. Those are really all the steps that you need on the Salesforce side, and just to give you an idea of what the checkout flow will somewhat look like for your customers. I can show you using a test card that Stripe provides that triggers this authentication process using one of our pay links. We have other test cards that are available to use for different testing scenarios. We've got links to Stripe's full page of test cards in our documentation on SCA specifically. So I've just copied one of those test cards from another screen I have off to the side. And now I'm going to go to a transaction record. And this is going to be very similar to the experience prior to this change. I'm using the same Stripe gateway. I've got a pay link here. The only thing you'll notice with this is my pay link domain is a bit different, and that is because at the time of recording this video, this particular change has not been pushed live yet. But by the time you watch this, as in right now, as you're watching this, we will have pushed this change to our live pay link domain. And you won't see this domain. You'll see our standard paylink.blackthorn domain. So on clicking or distributing the paylink, it's going to be exactly the same experience that your users were accustomed to. So here's an example of a paylink. When I click pay, it's going to load the checkout experience as normal. And then just fill out this checkout with a test card. Now this is a test card from Stripe that triggers this authentication requirement. Just fill out this form. Okay, and then I'm going to click pay. Okay, and now this is where the difference comes in. So in a live example, your customer won't see this particular page because we're seeing this page because we've used a test card that Stripe has made available to trigger this authentication flow. So in test mode, you'll get an option to complete the authentication, which will set this transaction as completed and captured. Or you can fail it to simulate what it would look like if a customer were to fail the authentication and essentially mark the transaction as failed. So the experience for the customer is going to look different based on what that bank requires for authentication. But the change that we've made in Paylink is just to kind of expose this authentication flow that Stripe uses through our Paylink so that you can continue to collect payments with Paylink and meet those SCA requirements if you're in the European Economic Area. So that is the example with Paylink, and I'll just complete this and refresh that transaction so that you can see it looks again, other than this step where we're taken through an authentication flow, it's still a very similar experience overall. Once that's complete and this page reloads, you will see that it is completed, captured, and pending. And then very quickly, I'll just kind of shift over and show you one of our hosted donations forms for those customers using our donations app that are affected by SCA. I've gone ahead and this is a very bare bones donation test form, but I've gone ahead and pre-filled this with that same test card just to show you that it's a very similar experience that you just saw in Paylink. When they enter a card, that's going to trigger that SCA requirement, or that requirement for additional authorization through 3D Secure. We'll see this additional prompt load for next steps for that customer who is making the donation in this case to complete the authentication so that that payment will be successful. So those are our two new features related to checkouts and SCA support thus far. we do have support for SCA coming in our events checkout in our roadmap. So the next new feature we're going to talk about is MOTO with Stripe for manually key payments. And this is an extension of the prior new feature we discussed, where this is applicable to customers affected by SCA regulations in Europe. This particular new feature, unlike the prior, is related to situations where you are keying in credit card details directly to Salesforce as opposed to the customer going through a checkout experience like you saw in our PayLink and donations examples. So MOTO stands for mail order, telephone order, and it encompasses those situations where transaction is initiated and maybe you have the customer on the phone, or I don't know how applicable mail order is in this day and age, but any situation where the card number is being manually keyed in, and typically the card is not physically present with the person processing the payment. In the context of our app, this would mean those situations where you're potentially using the virtual terminal. Also situations where you're using our payment method object and transaction object directly, either directly through the Salesforce interface, or I know a lot of our customers have built quick actions and screen flows, automation to collect those details from their users at different points during their internal business processes. So if you do either of those two things, use the virtual terminal or collect payment methods directly in the payment method and transaction objects, either manually or through automation, and you are affected by SCA regulations, these are steps that you need to follow to ensure that your processes are working prior to SCA enforcement, which has had kind of a long rollout process, but there's by the end of the year, we're going to see a lot more banks declining transactions if you don't meet their requirements. So there are a few additional steps that are needed to enable MOTO, unlike enabling SCA, which was a very quick and easy to set up in your Salesforce org to use with our app. There are a few other steps needed with MOTO payments. So we're going to kind of walk through those today. So the biggest thing, the first thing that I suggest that you do, let me switch over to this other screen here. The first thing you need to do is reach out to Stripe support. Stripe support has to enable, or they call it, they have to gate your account for MOTO. So there is a setting on the back end that they have to enable once you request it for you to be able to process payments using this MOTO flag, which allows you to successfully create and capture payments bypassing that 3D secure flow. So if you log into your Stripe dashboard, you can go to the help icon, and then there's a contact support link from there that'll initiate a chat with Stripe support. And then you can just tell them that you need to get your account gated for MOTO, and then they'll take it from there, ask you whatever questions that are needed for your particular account, and then take care of getting that setting set up properly on the back end. So that step is needed. That's the first, that will need to be completed and confirmed by Stripe before you can continue with the well, you can go ahead and take care of these additional steps, but this step is absolutely essential before you can start testing your configuration in Salesforce. Of course, the other side to this, and we covered this in our last, when we covered the other new feature related to PayLink and donations with SCA. So you would want to come into Salesforce and go to Setup. You want to go to Custom Settings, and then in the Blackthorn Pay Trigger Settings, there is an Enable SCA checkbox. So if that's not already checked, you'll want to make sure to click Edit and check that here and click Save. There are a couple of other new fields that are related to SCA in particular, and I'm sorry, not SCA, but MOTO in particular. One of them is on the payment gateway record. So you probably will need to add this to your page layout, because by default we don't add these onto page layouts when you upgrade. The name of this field is Stripe MOTO enabled. So you need to make sure that you add this to the page layout and that it's checked to make sure that the virtual terminal, if you use the virtual terminal, will automatically set the MOTO flag on your payment method to bypass the 3D secure flow and successfully process what they call an off-session payment, which means it kind of doesn't follow that authentication flow that other types of transactions would if your customer were using PayLink or donations in this case. So you want to make sure that that's on the layout and checked. And then there's also a field on the payment method that you'll want to make sure is checked. And we'll look at that in a second because that's only needed under certain circumstances. So now that this is enabled, so this is assuming that you have Stripe has gated the MOTO feature for your account. You have an SCA enabled in the custom settings in Blackthorn Pay Trigger settings. And you've also added this Stripe MOTO enabled field to the payment gateway layout, and you've checked it and saved it. Then you should be able to use the virtual terminal as normal without any issues. So I mentioned there's a link of test cards that trigger this authentication flow that Stripe provides. So we've got a link to those cards in our documentation if you wanted to test some of this out using a test gateway. I will note actually on that topic that when you request Stripe enable MOTO for your account, please ask them to gate it for both live and test mode on your account, so that if you need to process any test payments, that it's applicable for both. But now that we've got all of those steps configured, the virtual terminal will work as just as before. So you can add payment methods. It automatically, sets that payment method up for MOTO transactions, both for the current transaction you're processing and future transactions. So the last piece I want to talk about with this specifically is if you fall into that last category where you either have your users manually creating payment methods from the payment method tab, or you have quick actions or screen flows or other automations set up that creates a payment method record in the background. So you'll need to make sure, one, that there's one additional checkbox that needs to be either checked when you're manually going through that, or you need to update your automation and processes to check this additional box once SCA is fully enforced at the end of the year. So I'm just going to show you what this checkbox is and what it looks like if you were to manually put this in. Of course, if you've got some sort of a process that creates these payment methods, you can check this, just kind of have the record update part of your process, or the record creation part of your process, check this box kind of on the back end, so that your users aren't having the extra step. So if I click new payment method, and I'm going to just stay with the card record type, of course, because this is only applicable to cards. The details can be filled out as normal, so really everything on this left-hand side. And then we've got this new field on the payment method object called Enable MOTO. So this is the field that you would want to add to your automation or instruct your users to check to make sure that we bypass the 3D secure flow in cases where you're manually keying in a payment method to use for payments without going through the 3DS authentication. So checking this box will ensure that when you try and subsequently capture a transaction with a 3D secure card, that it goes through successfully without that additional step. We have a full page in our documentation for SCA and MOTO, both with detailed walkthrough of how to set these up in your org, some additional videos, the links to those test cards, also some frequently asked questions, a lot around, what if, what about my payment methods that are already valid, prior to SCA being enforced, will those still work? And the answer to that is yes, of course, but there are a lot of questions and considerations that might come up, and the best place to look for that is to find that page, which is going to be linked to our release notes for December, and review the frequently asked questions with the answers. And you can also, of course, open a case with us from our community page, and we're happy to answer any additional questions that aren't covered in our documentation or our videos. So now we'll go through enhancements and new fields included in this release. This first set of enhancements apply to multiple gateways. We have a few others that are specific to some of our gateways, such as Stripe and Spreedly, but we'll first kind of go through these general enhancements. These include new virtual terminal interface controls. Go through that in detail in just a second. I'll show you that in Salesforce. We've also added a button to the payment gateway customer record so that you can manually push these to the gateway. We also have a new roll down feature on the payment schedule that pushes changes to the payment gateway field down to the related transactions. So I'm going to jump over to Salesforce and walk through these three features. So first we'll look at the virtual terminal controls. Now the controls themselves, most of them, are not new to the December release. We did talk about these in the October release, and we'll do a brief review of what those are. But the two things that I really want to highlight that are new related to the virtual terminal and these controls is one, that we've moved them out of the prior custom setting that they were in to a new dedicated custom setting called Blackthorn Payments Virtual Terminal. And also we have added one new ability, and that is to make the amount field read-only on in a community on the virtual terminal. So we'll look at both of those items. So just as a brief overview of what these controls are, if you aren't familiar or you missed the October webinar. So this is the virtual terminal on a Lightning page by default. So if I were to just load this, come into this sales document, for example, from another page, when it loads initially, it's going to load with the new single charge as the primary action. And then you can change it to new payment method. And prior to the October release, we didn't have an ability to really control which of these actions loaded by default. We didn't have controls to restrict one action or the other so that it only displayed one instead of both. There are use cases where they only want users to do this certain thing at the certain point in the process. So we introduced those controls to be able to default to a different action if you wanted the payment method screen to load first, or to disable one of the two of them altogether if you didn't want to give your users the ability to do both. So in this release, what we have done, I'll kind of walk back here. We did have these before in our Blackthorn paid trigger settings. And I got to this menu by coming to setup, and in the quick find, I just typed custom, and then I went to custom settings. And so we've moved these particular group of settings from this Blackthorn paid trigger settings custom setting to the Blackthorn Payments virtual terminal, which is a new custom setting. So I'm going to click manage. And then let's focus on the top section first. So we've got the ability to default to the new payment method. So if you click this, check this, it will, when the page loads, the virtual terminal will default to the new payment method action instead of the new single charge. And then we have these other two, disable new payment method or disable new charge, and that actually will restrict one of the two options. So if you don't want to give your users both options, you only want them to be able to do one or the other, you can use these settings to restrict one of them. And then new for the December release, we also have disable amount in communities. And I'll show you what this looks like in a community, but essentially this gives you the control to lock down the amount field, make it read only, so that the community user cannot change the amount they are paying through the terminal. The other thing I want to point out in here is this ability to kind of apply these at a more granular level. So you can actually configure these for different users or different profiles. So if we take a look just at this first option here, I've configured this one for myself just for the purposes of this demo, but you can also configure these for an entire profile. And you can control these settings at the user or profile level. So in this case, I have disabled new charge for myself on the virtual terminal. So that means that when I go back to this sales document, I'll just refresh the page here. And I'll give it a second to load. You'll see that I only have the ability to add a new payment method. I don't even have the option to switch back to new single transaction. Okay, we'll go back to this one and we'll look at the community specific setting that I configured here. So in this case, I have created this particular setting for the customer community profile. And I have checked that I want to disable the amount in communities, which makes the amount read-only. And then the terminal new payment method is what I want to default. So when the terminal loads in the community, I want the new payment method action to be the first screen that loads. And then when they switch to the new single transaction action, I want the amount field to be read-only so they cannot update it. So I have here we are. I'll go ahead and refresh this page. This is just one of our test communities that we use for demos, and I have the virtual terminal on a sales document page. So I'll give this a second to load here. You can see that it is loading with new payment method as the primary option. And if I switch over to new single charge, again, give it a second to load. You can see that the amount field is not editable, so it's read-only. So pretty cool. We are getting a lot of interest in folks using the terminal inside their communities, and so this just gives you more granular control over what options your users have using the terminal. Okay, so now we'll look at the other two items in this enhancement section. So we've added a new button to the Payment Gateway customer record called Push to Gateway. And by default, what we do with this particular record is when it's created, when the record is saved, we automatically push these to the gateway, either Stripe or Authorize.net, and get an automatic response with the customer ID or the customer profile ID, and we store that on the record. This is unlike a lot of our other objects where it requires a manual push to the gateway to create the record. These have always just been a bit different. And there are some pitfalls to this. It's very convenient, but there are times where maybe there's a data entry issue or a typo. And when we save the record, it returns an error from the gateway. So what we've done is we've added the ability to turn off that automatic push and manually push these into the gateway. So there's two things that you would need if you wanted to use this feature. You would have to add this push to gateway button to your Payment Gateway customer page layout. Also, in our Blackthorn Pay trigger settings, which is in custom settings, if you go to setup, you would want to make sure that you check this disable creating a Stripe customer. This disables the automatic push And then once you've done those two things, you can create a payment gateway customer record, save it, review the details for accuracy and completeness, and then push to gateway. This also is useful for triggering any changes. So if you need to come and make a change to email address or name, any of the fields here, that you can then come and use this push to gateway button to trigger those updates. Okay, and then we'll take a look now at payment schedule, this payment schedule roll down feature. So this in particular is just really a very quick convenient update that we made. Basically, when you create a payment schedule, you set a payment gateway, and that payment gateway rolls down to all of the transactions that are generated in that schedule. Well, let's say that you created this gateway, or I'm sorry, this payment schedule, and maybe you forgot to set the gateway, and it just defaulted to whatever the default payment gateway for that org currently is. And maybe it was the wrong gateway. So prior to this change, if you made a mistake and you set the wrong payment gateway, you either had to cancel the whole schedule, start over, choose the right gateway, or you had to go through each of the related transactions and manually change the payment gateway for each of them. And it's important for them to have the right payment gateway assigned, because that's the gateway account that will be used to process the transaction. So now if you make a mistake, you can just change it on the payment schedule, save it, and that rolls down to all of the related transactions. You can see that this is all updated. Okay. Next, we'll go through our enhancements and new fields that are specific to Stripe. We have quite a list of items to run through that are enhanced for Stripe customers in particular. So we will go through a new feature that we've added to block American Express payments for customers using certain checkouts like Document Link and PayLink, as well as those who use our REST API. We also have improved our currency conversion with Stripe, and not so much improve the functionality. We've supported this for a while, where we bring in the converted amounts if you capture a transaction in a different currency than your bank account settles in. This enhancement is more so around the timing in which we bring in those converted values. So we'll take a look at that. We have added a new field to our subscription object to give more context about the invoice behavior when you have a paused subscription. We have added some additional auto-population of fields on Stripe invoices when there is an account that's related to a Stripe invoice. Similar to what we discussed earlier with Payment Gateway customers, we've now added some manual controls around the product object and how those get pushed to Stripe to give you greater control over the timing in which that happens. And then also we now support invoice line metadata with Stripe billing in particular. So I'll jump over to Salesforce and we'll take a look at some of these new enhancements. We'll first look at the ability to block American Express payments with Stripe with PayLink, Document Link, or a REST API. So for some context here, a reason that you might want to block American Express is due to higher processing fees. And so we've enabled this ability that you can turn on, turn off in Salesforce to just make sure that if you prefer not to extend that option of American Express to your customers, you can disable it. So there is a new field that you would need to add to your payment gateway record. It's called Block Amex Transactions in REST API. I have it here on this layout. And you'll need to add this field and make sure it is checked in order to use this feature. And so I'm going to, over on another screen, I have a test American Express card. I'm going to just copy that. And then I'm going to go to a transaction and open a PayLink. Okay, and so I'm going to kind of simulate a customer trying to use a PayLink with an American Express card. Paste in that number I copied. Okay, and then when they click pay, this is the experience. This is the actual error message that this user would see. Basically that American Express is not supported. Please use a different card. And then at that point they can try again with a different card and complete the transaction. This is again supported with PayLink, Document Link, and those who use a REST API with a custom built checkout or custom process flow that you've created. And again, it's just one field that you need to add to your Stripe payment gateway record and enable to take advantage of this new enhancement. Okay. Next, I will show you the currency conversion enhancements that we've added in this package. So again, this is more about the timing in which we bring some of these additional values into Salesforce. So there are two fields in particular on a transaction record that are specific to transactions processed in Stripe where there's currency conversion that's happened. And these two fields are currency conversion payout amount and exchange rate. Now we've supported bringing these values back into into Salesforce from Stripe for many months now, many releases. The difference between earlier releases and our December release is that we now are able to bring these amounts in much sooner. So before, it took several days to get these amounts to come back in, and I'll show you what this means in just a moment. We'll process a transaction in real time. So we used to bring the currency conversion payout amount, which is essentially the kind of the amount that's going to go into the bank account of that settlement currency for your bank account. We used to bring all of those details in when the payout was processed, so it could be several days before you would see the actual converted amount in Salesforce. And now instead we bring it in immediately when the transaction is charged. So just to show you what this looks like, I have just an open transaction here in Salesforce. Right now the currency is US dollars. I'm going to change that just so I can show you that conversion. I'll change it to Canadian dollars. So go ahead and save that. I have a payment method tied to this transaction, and so when I process this payment, Stripe will go ahead and convert 25 Canadian dollars to US dollars, and then when we get the response back from Stripe, we'll see that these currency conversion fields are populated, and then we will know the exact amount that we should expect in the relevant currency. In this case, that is US dollars, because that's the currency our bank account tied to Stripe settles in. So I'll go ahead and click the capture button on this transaction. Go ahead and click charge. Give this a second to reload here. Okay, so now you can see that the currency conversion payout amount has populated. So this 25 Canadian dollars will be $19.26 US. And then it also populates the exchange rate that was used to calculate this converted amount. And again, what you would have seen before this particular release is that it would have processed that this amount in Canadian dollars, but it wouldn't be till the next payout where this transaction was included that you would see these values populate. And this is just because it requires us to get sort of an expanded list of attributes from Stripe's API. And while we were doing that, we do still do that when the payout gets processed and we have the payout batch that runs to relate all the transactions to a particular payout. We're now getting those details earlier as well to kind of get more details than we could have in the past. So this is a pretty cool feature. Just just having these in sooner, great for reporting if you need them earlier than the payout processing. So that is the currency conversion enhancement. Next, we're going to look at the new pause subscription field on the subscription object in Salesforce. We actually have several fields, and I have them at the top of this layout. So we've got paused invoice behavior. This is the new field. Resumes at. So resumes at and pause were both here prior to this release, which was useful if you needed to see pause subscriptions in Salesforce. Pause invoice behavior goes a step further and gives you a little more context about that subscription, pause subscription in Salesforce. And I will note that these fields are currently read-only in the sense that they aren't actionable from Salesforce. So you couldn't update these fields in Salesforce and expect the subscription to update in Stripe. These will really just display changes that were made in Stripe directly. So what I'll do is I'm going to go into this subscription in Stripe, and I'm going to pause it. So in the Stripe dashboard, you would go to this Update Subscription button. I am wrong. Let me back up here for a second. You actually go to these three dots beside Update Subscription, and you want to go to Pause Payment Collection. And then you have a few options. So you can set a pause duration of indefinite, or you can set a custom date. So I'm going to set a custom date, and by default it's put us out January the 15th. I think that's the next invoice date. So I'll push it out. Let's say we'll push it out to March 15th. And then this is where the new field comes into play. Then you can decide what to do with the invoices during this pause period. Do you want to keep them as drafts, just in case you want to send them out at a later date, or as your customer wants to pay them? You can mark them as uncollectible, or you can void them. So I'll just select void for this test. Go ahead and click pause on the subscription. So coming back into Salesforce, of course, we've got webhook events that we would need to wait for them to process in order to see these changes. So let me jump over. I'm going to manually process this just for the sake of time. Go ahead and process. Normally this happens automatically. We have a scheduled job that runs every 5 minutes to parse out these webhook events and update the records or create the records in Stripe. I'm sorry, in Salesforce. So if I go back to that subscription, you can now see that these fields are updated. Paused checkbox has been checked. You can see the paused invoice behavior is void, and then you can see when this subscription is due to resume. Again, the new piece of this is just that we now display the option that you've chosen for invoice behavior during pause subscription. So that is a cool new feature that we've added, or enhancement that we've added for Stripe billing customers. Okay, next I want to show you that we've added some additional pre-population of values if you create a Stripe invoice from an opportunity. So maybe you do your Stripe billing customer and you create one-off invoices, which you can do from an opportunity. So I am currently on an opportunity that has a product and is related to an account. So I'm going to use our Create Invoice button. And then, of course, we have two record types. If you're a Stripe billing customer and you want itemized invoices in Stripe, you would use the Stripe invoice record type. I'm going to create this. Okay, I'll return to the record. So really what we're doing in this particular enhancement, I'll actually click on the sales document that we just created. So now if we scroll down to specifically these address fields, so prior to this release, we weren't populating all of these, or pre-populating all of the address details from the related account, and now we do. So when the sales document gets created, we associate the account as both the bill to and the ship to, and if you have values in the bill to and ship to addresses, we just populate them on this sales document. So this just saves the user a step, so they're not having to manually key in these addresses. Of course, they're changeable, so if you want to, if there's a correction that's needed, you can correct them on once they've populated. But this is just a small enhancement to decrease data entry and make sure that your records have are more complete. So this is that new enhancement related to specifically for Stripe billing customers. Next, we'll look at the product changes. So similar to the payment gateway customer that we talked about earlier, we now have some manual controls around pushing products to Stripe. And unlike the payment gateway customer we talked about earlier, which applied to both Stripe and Authorize.net, the products are specific to Stripe and more specifically to customers who use our Stripe billing integration. So prior to this change, when you set the payment gateway record on an existing or a new or existing product in Salesforce, and then you set the type to service, we would make an automatic call out to Stripe to create that product in Stripe and return a product ID. So there's, again, a couple pitfalls with doing that automatically. It can be very convenient for many reasons, but at the same time, products in particular, you can't change very much about them once they're created in Stripe. So kind of once you push them, there's very little that you can do to update them. So you want to make sure that you have an error-free experience, or it's a complete record before it's pushed to Stripe. So we now have the ability to push them manually. So there is a custom setting that you have to enable, and again, this is in the Blackthorn Pay custom settings, Blackthorn Pay trigger settings. And this custom setting in particular is disable change data capture. So it's not the most descriptive label, to be fully transparent, but we have this documented, and you can always come back to this section of the webinar. You can also take a look at the product page on the Stripe billing section of our documentation if you need to refer back to this step. But this enable change data capture setting can be enabled to disable our automatic push to Stripe for products. And then once that setting has been saved, you can either use our push to Stripe checkbox if you've got some sort of automation creating products or users creating products. There's also a push to Stripe button that can be used instead. The default behavior remains the automatic push. This is just you have an ability to override that if you want to start manually pushing these to have more control over the completeness of the record and the point at which you push to Stripe. All right, and so the last thing that I want to talk about is a little bit more difficult to demo, mainly because it's one of these features that we support via the API, but you can't actually do in the Stripe dashboard. So it's one of those things that we can kind of do above and beyond what you could even do if you were just managing everything in Stripe in the dashboard directly. So for I want to say all now, that may not be entirely accurate, but I would say most Stripe objects we support Stripe metadata. And so Stripe metadata just allows you to essentially store additional data on a Stripe record that you can't really store in other fields on that particular record. So we have updated our code and our Salesforce package in December to support metadata at the invoice item or the invoice line level. So from Salesforce, what that looks like is so I'm on a sales document record, as you can see on my screen. So we have supported invoice metadata for a while now. So we're talking about metadata at the invoice line level. So I'll go to a line item here. And the reason that you might want to do this, and this was a particular request from a few customers, and so in this case they needed to make sure that they were passing specific data related to a checkout experience from their e-commerce platform through to Stripe and then eventually through to Salesforce. And so by passing custom values down through the metadata, we can see that data getting pulled all the way through from their e-commerce platform through to Stripe and then via the webhooks into Salesforce. So the cool thing about our app is we support metadata syncing both from Stripe to Salesforce through webhooks and then also from Salesforce to Stripe via custom metadata types. So you can map field values to Stripe and incoming. So I'll show you, let's see, we've got a new field on the line item called metadata. So this stores any metadata that is on this particular record in Stripe. And this one, you can actually see that there is metadata. I actually pushed this record from Salesforce to Stripe. And so I have some metadata mapping set up in Salesforce. And we've got documentation on this, that topic. If you'd like to take a look, we've got a section specifically about Stripe metadata, the mechanism for how it syncs if you are, syncing it from Stripe through to Salesforce or the opposite from Salesforce to Stripe. So I won't get into the weeds on that, but basically I have set this up to where I am essentially passing a custom field from Salesforce into Stripe, into the metadata. And so I synced this over, and when I got the response back, once this record got created as a line item in the Stripe dashboard, it sent me back all of the values that populated in the invoice item metadata. And you can see description is my custom mapping from Salesforce. And so there's no great way to show you this because you can't see invoice line item metadata on the invoice line item in Stripe, but I can show you in the records that when I push this into Stripe as an invoice item, this description, which was a field that I mapped from Salesforce, got pushed into the metadata. And again, the use case here is it's not everyone uses Stripe metadata, but it's very useful for passing extra information from one system to another. So in this particular case, if you've got some special attribute that you need to pass on with this particular line item, you can pass it through the metadata. The metadata will stay with this all the way into Salesforce. And also, if you want to assign metadata from Salesforce and push it into Stripe and then perhaps into another system that you have integrated, you have the ability to do so. It just gives you a lot of flexibility. So the enhancement that we've made, this release is just adding support for the invoice item or the line item, which we didn't have prior. And finally, the last enhancement that we're going to cover is ACH or eCheck support for Spreedly gateways with the virtual terminal. So prior to this release, we supported Spreedly cards, or creating card payment methods with Spreedly gateways through the virtual terminal. And now we also support ACH or eCheck transactions payment methods through the virtual terminal using Spreedly gateways. So Spreedly does support 120 plus payment gateways, but there's a much smaller list of those individual gateways that support e-checks or ACH. And we have a link in our documentation, a link to Spreedly's documentation and our documentation, which lists out those particular payment gateways that support e-checks and also some of their individual requirements. So just as a quick demo, I will show you what that process looks like. So I'm back on the sales document here. I've got the virtual terminal up and new payment method is my action. Spreedly, I have a test Spreedly gateway set up. I've gone ahead and put in all the details for this payment method. So the test routing number, test account number, billing email. I'll go ahead and add that test bank account from the virtual terminal. You can see that it was created. I'm going to just open this up so we can take a look at the record. Okay, you can see that we've got a valid payment method status. The last 4 digits of the account number are here. All right, and then if we go back to the virtual terminal, we're just going to use this to capture capture transaction. Oh, it reverted back to my default gateway there. And then I can go ahead and capture this transaction. Go ahead and take a look at this, and you can see that this transaction is completed and captured. So if, for the most part, e-check transactions taken through Spreedly gateways will return a successful response. And if there's an issue settling due to insufficient funds or some other processing error, which typically would come days later after the initial charge attempt was made, those will get communicated to you outside of Spreedly from that particular gateway. So via email from your gateway account, or whatever method that particular payment gateway uses to communicate failures of that nature. But that wraps up our new enhancements for the December release. We have all of these detailed in our release notes with links to specific feature pages for more information. And again, you can always reach out to us at Blackthorn Support if you have any questions about anything that we have covered in this enhancement section. Next, we'll go through our bug fixes that are included in this latest December release. So we had quite a few, some for specific gateways, other just general bug fixes. And so instead of reading through line by line this very wordy slide, I'm going to just show you in Salesforce and kind of walk you through what we fixed and give you a little bit of context. So first we'll start with a payment schedule. So we did have an error that was being thrown in prior releases if you were trying to use the cancel and refund option on payment schedules. So to back up a step, you can either cancel a schedule, which will just cancel any future transactions in that schedule, or you can cancel and refund, which will cancel the future transactions and refund any prior captured transactions in the schedule. So the bug was when you try to cancel and refund, you would get a very particular error. And so we've resolved that. So also worth noting that this cancel and refund button has been deprecated. If you click it, it will display a message that it has been deprecated. So you will want to use the cancel button instead. Another thing I noticed preparing for this webinar that we will be fixing in a future release is the message here is incorrect. So we are not generating transactions. We are actually canceling transactions in this payment schedule. So you have two options. You can cancel or cancel and refund. So cancel and refund will cancel all of future transactions. It will refund all the prior transactions that were captured. Go back and take a look here. you can see that all of these have been updated to completed and refund, and then the one open transaction that we had is now canceled. All right, so that is the fix for payment schedules. The next item that we had on the list is we had a mapping issue with the virtual terminal when you were adding a new payment method. The email address populated wasn't getting moved over to the payment method record. So I have the terminal open here and I've pre-populated some test data. So I'm going to add this payment method. And now we'll take a look at this record just to double check that it has pushed over the email address, and it is here. So that was fixed in this latest package. The next item, this was actually an issue in the November release for, and this would have only affected anyone who freshly installed our application in a new environment or for the first time in a Salesforce org. So we were seeing some inconsistent behavior if you were going through our setup wizard and using this make magic happen button, that it was skipping steps. So it was skipping permission sets, and then it was skipping the pay link step instead of kind of moving through in a linear direction. We were actually missing some of the steps. So that was corrected in this December release. The next thing that we'll look at is actually related to customers who use Stripe and our donations app. So there was a particular error that was displaying if you use our donations app and you got a dispute from Stripe. So disputes are created in the Stripe dashboard by, if one of your customers disputes a payment, Stripe will create that dispute record, and then we sync that into Salesforce through the webhooks. Well, we were having an error pop up if you used our donations app and you got a dispute error. The webhook would not get processed properly, and you would get a validation error. I don't have a way to show you what the error was from before, other than I have a screenshot from a Blackthorn log, so I'll kind of pull that into the frame. So basically saying that there was a custom validation, a field custom validation exception, where when that dispute record was being created, we were unchecking the NPSP payment record, and we were getting a validation error because of this. So we've had to make some changes so that you can continue to use the donations app, and then you can also use the dispute functionality that we have inside of Salesforce if you're a Stripe customer. So that's been fixed. Another one that we fixed in this latest release is around gateway fees that are getting, we noticed that if you authorize a transaction from the Stripe dashboard. So in this case, I have a transaction that I've already authorized for the purpose of this demo. So this is where we've authorized but not yet fully captured the funds. You can see in the dashboard there are no fees that are populated until the capturing happens. So, and of course, if I go to this particular transaction in Salesforce, which is also in an authorized state, just pull up a link to that here. Okay, so I showed you the payment record in the Stripe dashboard. This is the Salesforce side record. You can see the transaction status is completed and authorized. We don't have any gateway fees, just like in the dashboard currently. So what we were seeing with this bug is that when you capture this, and those fees do then populate on the record, I'll just give this a quick refresh. Okay, you see these fees are here now. What we were seeing in Salesforce is that these fees were not getting populated on the transaction record. So it was all staying blank. It was updating the transaction as completed and captured, but the fees weren't getting parsed out of the webhook event. So I will go ahead, I'm going to just manually process this webhook event so that I can show you that this is fixed. Okay. All right, and now you can see that these fees have updated. We've pulled over the payment gateway fees, and this particular issue has been fixed. On the same topic, we did have another issue that was related, where webhook events weren't always processing in the same order. There's a bit of inconsistency, and where this became a problem is specifically around transactions that are brought into Salesforce from webhook events. So if you there were two particular webhook events that if one processed before the other, the transaction and payment method would get created, but a payment gateway customer was not tied to them. So we had to make sure that when we processed webhook events that we were taking a processing order into consideration. Kind of the I guess full context on this is that if you were seeing instances where transactions were getting created via the webhooks, where there was a customer associated in Stripe, but there was no payment gateway customer on that record in Salesforce, it was very likely that this bug was affecting your processes. So we've addressed that so that every time a transaction record comes into Salesforce via the webhooks, and there is a customer ID, that customer record gets attached to transactions. Next, we had an issue where our ACH payment methods were failing. We were getting an error from Stripe if we were trying to capture a transaction using an ACH payment method from Salesforce when you have SCA enabled in the org. So this would only happen if you had SCA enabled. So it's very unlikely that you actually encountered this, because up until this release, we didn't have a lot of documentation around SCA and that particular custom setting that would had to have been enabled in order to see this bug. But so on my screen now, I've got an open transaction, and I've just got an existing ACH payment method tied to it. I have SCA enabled in this org, and I'm going to capture this transaction. Okay. Now you can see, as normal with Stripe ACH transactions, this has gone into a pending status, where prior we were seeing an error message down in this section stating there was no such bank account or no such payment method, something along those lines. Just had to change the way that we send that request to Stripe when we're using a bank account, going through that payment intents API, which is part of our SCA integration updates. So that's been fixed. And then finally, we had some issues with our virtual terminal, where if authorized.net was the gateway chosen, that the payment method fields were not populating properly. So if you were adding a payment method either from that new transaction screen, or if you were switching over to this new payment method action, this form at the bottom here with all of the input fields was not loading with authorized.net. We were also having an issue with Stripe's, well, not actually no particular gateway, but if you were trying to add a payment method from this new single transaction screen using any gateway, this particular action was also coming up as a blank page. So that's been addressed in this latest release in the new virtual terminal, or in not the new virtual terminal, but the bug fix for this particular release. And that is a quick summary of all of the bug fixes that we've included in our December release. Again, we've got full context on these in our release notes if you needed to dig into these any further. And lastly, there is one, I don't want to say known issue, but one thing that we have noticed with some of the pending release updates, or what Salesforce used to refer to as critical updates, that affects our package currently. There is a release update that is scheduled to be enforced in the summer 21 release, but right now you can enable test run for it. And we have found that this causes the new payment method fields on a virtual terminal not to load properly. So we are working internally to figure out what we need to do, or what steps we need to provide to get around this once this critical update is fully enforced. For the time being, if you are using our virtual terminal, you'll want to make sure that test run is disabled on this particular release update. The name of the release update is Enable Secure Static Resources for Lightning Components. And again, it's scheduled for enforcement in the summer 21 release. And you can optionally go ahead and enable it if you're trying to proactively test the effects of these in your particular org. So I have it enabled. Test run is enabled in this org currently. And if I go to virtual terminal, you can see that on the new payment method action, I'll go ahead and just do a reload so you can see how it looks on page load. Switch to new payment method. The input fields are not rendering. They should be between this related to section and the add button. And then likewise, if I switch back to new single charge and try and add a payment method this way, it's the same behavior where I don't see the input fields. So of course, if I disable test run on this update, go back and reload the terminal, have to forgive my my slow connection right now. It doesn't typically take this long, and it could be just some resetting here. Okay, so now if I try to add a new payment method once it's turned off, you see that this form loads as expected, and the same with going from the new single charge screen, the form loads as expected here. So just a key to note that if you see your virtual terminal payment method fields aren't loading, that is the first thing that I would check, is this enable secure static resources for Lightning components. Just make sure that test run is off for now, and then we will continue to communicate any extra steps that you need to take, or any additional information we have as we work through this issue on our side as well. So this wraps up our overview of the December 2020 payments release. Thank you for joining me, and please let us know if you have any issues or any questions.